Okay, so everybody heard that. Yes. Well, welcome to you all. It's wonderful to have you with us, and I remain grateful that we're able to offer these community education programs. I am sad we can't offer these also in Spanish. We're working towards having that be possible, I hope, in the upcoming future. We would ask people to keep themselves muted during this talk, and I am also going to remove that I'm going to just remove that people unmuting themselves. I'm going to just remove that as a privilege until we get to the Q&A points. And if you try to ask a question and you can't because I have you muted, just wave wildly or put something in the chat and I'll turn that feature back on. This morning, I'm really very happy to have Mike Bernhardt and his beautiful book, Voices of Grief, with us. I want to just say a few words about the foundation before we get started with Mike's presentation. And for those of you that have not been with us before, welcome. The Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation is a not-for-profit organization that's been inspired by the life of psychiatrist, humanitarian, and hospice pioneer, Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. It's in the spirit of embracing all of life, which includes death, that we further her mission and vision through collaborations, education, and advocacy. And Ken Ross, her son, has been the president of the foundation. It has expanded across the globe. He's heading tomorrow to Africa to join health ministers and the Palliative Care and Hospice Congress of Africa for their meeting. And so the work is really important, and this community education program is just a beautiful way to offer support to people in the community. So I remain grateful that there's a place for it here at the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation. And as much as Elisabeth is known for her 5 stages of death or 5 stages of grief, what Elisabeth really, for those that knew her, was known for was her unabashed love of life and the belief, the deeply held belief that people should live their life full out until their last breath. So I want to make sure that we are also celebrating her deep love of the human condition and of living our life to the best of our ability. If anybody would like to put up in chat where it is that you are zooming in from, I know there's people from across the country and often from across the globe. So thank you again. And before, I'm going to say just a little bit about Mike, and then Mike is going to introduce himself to you all. And we'll spend about an hour. Mike will be talking and reading from his book, and then we'll have Q&A. And in the interim, if there's a question that comes up or something that moves you, please feel free to put it up in chat. I will be monitoring that. We ask for no crosstalk or conversation in chat during the time that we're doing the presentation. And then at the end of the first hour, we'll unmute everybody. We'll all go back through the chat to answer those questions for Mike. And we will be taking questions from you all. So Mike is an award-winning writer whose work has appeared in many print and online publications, including Diver Magazine, Journey Beyond Travel, GeoX Travel, Hidden Compass, and others. He grew up in New York City, where he wrote poetry and kept a journal throughout his teenage years. He moved to the San Francisco Bay Area when he was 19 and was working as an electrician when he met his first wife, Susan, in 1983. Susan died in 1991. In the years that followed, Mike has published the first edition of Voices of the Grieving Heart. I believe this is the 30th anniversary of the publication. He's remarried and raised a son with his second wife, Yvonne. Mike has volunteered as a peer grief support volunteer. He's a certified grief educator. He speaks to groups speaks on the radio and on podcasts to discuss his book, his experience of grief, and how poetry can help us to express the inexpressible. He and his family reside in the Bay Area in San Francisco with their 2 cats. So Mike, at this point, I am going to drop you down here into the spotlight. And thank you. Oh, Zippy, welcome. Zippy, you'll be seeing Ken soon. I just see Zippy is here. She's on our advisory board from Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you so much for joining us. So go ahead, Mike. Thank you also so much for joining us and sharing this beautiful book with us.
Well, hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm really glad to see so many people. So as Susan said, my name is Mike Bernhardt. I'm the editor and also a contributor to my book, Voices of the Grieving Heart. And Voice of the Grieving Heart is a collection of about 160 poems, short narratives, and images from 83 people whose loved ones died. So a bit about my background, as Susan said, my first wife died. She had a congenital heart condition. We knew about that the first time I met her. We spent hours talking about it on our first date, which was kind of weird actually, but she was very open about it. So we knew that was there. We didn't expect her to die unexpectedly, but she did. So it was a very sudden thing, even though we knew maybe she wouldn't live into her 80s. So she was 31. So as Susan also said, I had to deal with my grief, of course. And I'll talk a little bit more about how I did that and how this book came to be. But last year, after I published the second edition of this book, I became a certified grief educator because I wanted to be able to talk about grief more literally, with more literacy. I've since spoken twice for the National Association for Poetry Therapy, talking to them not so much about poetry, but about grief, because a lot of mental health professionals work with people who are grieving, but haven't actually been well trained in it. So the first edition of this book was required reading for a couple of years for a death and dying class that they used to have at St. Mary's College here in Moraga, where I live. And the current edition won a Reader's Favorite Award and an Independent Press Distinguished Book Award. So that's about that. So I think the best way for me to talk about what it was like when I lost my wife is to read something from my introduction. My wife, Susan, died unexpectedly in April 1991, the Sunday after Easter. I could never have imagined beforehand how transformative an experience that would be. Nothing was true anymore but the truths of her death and my continued existence. I was shaken to my foundations, forced to decide what I would keep of myself and what I would throw away. Every aspect of my life was subject to review, from my occupation to my spiritual beliefs, from my choice of friends to my choice of doctors. Although some friends were very supportive, for about a year, I also attended a weekly grief support group at the Center for Attitudinal Healing, which was started by Jerry Jampolsky back in the 80s, I think. I needed to spend time with people who knew how uncontrollable and consuming grief could be, who wouldn't ply me with explanations, consolation, and helpful advice. One of the guidelines of our group began with the words, "We recognize that love is listening." I wanted to be listened to and to hear other people's stories as well. Social niceties seemed pointless, and I gradually discarded some people from my life. I just could not bear the thought of having to relate to someone with whom I wasn't deeply bonded. I let my voicemail answer the telephone so I didn't have to speak to anyone. And I sometimes erased messages without even listening to them first. An acquaintance left a delicious tuna salad on my doorstep because I made believe there was no one home when she knocked. Though I appreciated her gift, I never thanked her or even spoke to her again. I began writing the day Susan died, keeping a journal, writing poetry, trying to document and express my grief and my transformation. It was the first time I'd done any writing in many years. Sometimes poetry was the only way to give words to the overwhelming emotions I struggled with. In finding that I could express my feelings creatively, I discovered a whole side of myself that had been lying dormant. Writing gave me a new sense of strength and wholeness. Now, when I look back, reading my poetry and journals, I can see how far I have come and remember what I went through. Doing that from time to time seems to have a healing quality of its own. I wanted to read about others' experience, but found little published material that interested me. I understood my grief from the inside. I didn't want to be taught about grief and the transformation I was going through. I couldn't concentrate on long texts anyway, and often got bored after the first few pages. I yearned for honest experience and validation rather than guidance. Voices of the Grieving Heart grew out of my desire to publish something for people who felt the same way I did. So one of the things I found was that writing poetry that honestly expressed how I was feeling had a very different quality than journaling. And as I said, it was immensely helpful for me. I mean, here's an example of the difference that I experienced in those two mediums. So I still have, I mean, I wrote that introduction in 1993, but I still have those journals that I mentioned I'd kept. And this was a journal entry that I wrote about a month after she died. Well, a month after she died. Susan died exactly 1 month ago. Maybe that's why it's so hard for me today. I miss her so much. I would give anything to have her back. Nothing else matters really. I would give anything to have her back. And then for contrast, here's a poem that I put in the book called Scream at the Ocean. I wrote it at around the same time after an afternoon by the Pacific Ocean. The ocean waves pile up on one another, rolling forward relentlessly, smashing onto the beach. And eyes wide open, powerful in rage, I scream with all my might, but the surf drowns my voice. I cannot bring her back. So I hope that you can kind of feel the difference between those two very different ways of writing about the same experience. The way I like to describe the difference is that when I write in a journal, I'm kind of explaining my experience to myself, which is very useful and important. But grief can be so intense that sometimes I couldn't even find the words for it. Poetry accesses the right side of the brain, the creative emotional side, rather than the logical thinking side. And it helped me to put language to images and emotions in a more direct way. And often the things that I wrote in my journal would lead to a poem. It got to a point where I didn't just want to read my own poetry. And I will say that one of the things I experienced was that in writing a poem and then reading it, it gave me clarity in a different way. It was, I'll talk a little bit about this later, but it was kind of like holding up a mirror to myself, being able to see what I was experiencing once I had found the words through poetry and imagery. So I wanted to read other people's poetry, but I really didn't find anything. There were a couple of published books, but they were mostly, a lot of it was by older authors, early 20th century. And it was a lot of, for me, it was a lot of style and not a lot of clarity of meaning. So I wanted to find poetry that helped me to feel what I was feeling. And I set out to create a book that would be helpful to me. So I put out calls for submissions through various print newsletters, because it was long before the internet was really a thing, asking about poems about the writer's personal experience of grief after their loved ones had died. And I did that through the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Center newsletter, the Compassionate Friends, the Universalist Unitarian Church. I still have, because I've kept all these things. Hopefully this comes out clearly with my background. This is the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Center newsletter from summer 1992. And in the back of it is an ad that I'll share with you, just because I think it's neat to see. Can you all see that? So this was the ad that I placed in the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Center newsletter and the others. And I basically said exactly what I just shared with you, that I was looking for poems that spoke to the heart rather than to the head. And I said at the end, I'm interested in work that speaks of human experience, not abstract philosophy. Quality in the academic sense is less important than how well the poem expresses what it sets out to express. A one-liner about the book might be poetry by people like you and me who wrote about their grief and healing. So I received over 200 poems, and I kind of just sorted through those. And what I found over time was that they kind of sorted themselves into different aspects of the grief experience. And so I whittled those 200 poems down to 65 from 45 different contributors. I was one of the contributors. I included 6 or 7 poems, and I published that first edition in 1994. So in late 2020, at my wife Yvonne's behest, I decided to republish the book because there was so much grief going on with COVID. And I decided I wanted to maybe add 2 or 3 poems to it that related to COVID in some way. And so I had a friend who runs the Institute for Poetic Medicine, and he does something called poetic medicine, like poetry therapy. And so he sent out an ad in his mailing list that was similar to the one I just shared with you. And I received another couple of 100 poems. Some of them had to do with COVID. Some of them were just about grief. And I mean, just is an odd word, but you know what I mean. And so I then ended up with about 150 poems from 80 different contributors. So the first question that somebody might ask is, why would you want to read other people's poetry about their grief? I mean, you might think the last thing you'd want to do when you're in pain is to read about other people's pain. But the reality is that what we most need when we're grieving is community. We can feel really isolated because we don't think other people can understand just how hard it is. And very often we're right, as anyone here who's grieved the loss of a loved one might understand. It means a lot to be with other people who really get it. The terms that are often used in grief work are witnessing and mirroring. We need our pain to be witnessed. We need to feel that other people are seeing us and understand where we are, and to accept us without judgment. Mirroring is when what someone says helps us to understand and accept ourselves without judgment. It's the reflecting back that helps us to see ourselves more clearly. What I found is that, and I think this is the reason I wanted other people's poetry, when we read a poem that expresses the thoughts or feelings that we're struggling with, we kind of experience both being witnessed by the author who we know has shared our experience, and we also experience that mirroring because they've given words to something that we may have struggled to give words to. Here's a poem that was written by a woman named Margaret Grote, whose best friend died. And I think you'll see again, the difference in the quality of, rather than just talking about how she felt. It's called Loss of a Friend. Words freeze tonight and stick to my tongue. Even the knocking on the door goes hollow, like wings of lost birds beating on the window glass. Outside, the streetlights push me into a circle of shadows, while I search strangers' faces, one by one, frantic to find someone I know. You have slipped into the dark, never turning back. But not all of the poems in the book are sad, and I'll get more into that a little bit later. This one's by a woman named Wendy Lichtman, whose mother had died. It's called The Argument Against Letting Go. My mother still won't let me wear tops with wide horizontal stripes. and she's been dead 10 years. They make me look too short, she says. You'd think I wouldn't need to listen to her anymore. You're wrong. You'd say I could go shopping without her. I could, but I usually don't. You see, given the choice between joking with her in the dressing room about the styles and the sales girls, enjoying with her the beauty of this knit, that color, hanging out together in such a comfortable way, just us two. Given the choice between that and the green, beige, pink horizontal striped sweater I passed up yesterday, given that choice, I opted again for mom. Can you blame me? So I'm going to assume that all of you are fairly familiar with Elisabeth's 5 stages of grief, originally 5 stages of dying: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. The problem is she spent really the rest of her life trying to clarify is that they're not really stages. They're more like facets, I like to say. Grief isn't linear. It's a very complex and convoluted journey. And it can take much, much longer than what Western society tells us it should. Some of you may have heard about the current DSM, and they consider that grieving intensely after a year is abnormal. But many people are in shock for the first year, and they haven't even really begun to grieve by that point. So there's really no rules for it. But I remember feeling angry at myself when I had a really hard day after maybe weeks of feeling a lot better. And so I over time, I slowly learned to accept that whatever I felt and whenever I felt it was okay and normal. One of the things that I hope that readers take from this book is that everyone is different and everyone's grief is different. But over time, most of us do integrate the loss into our lives. There's sort of a general trend over time, I would say, toward more wholeness and acceptance. And I found, as I said earlier, that the poems tended to fall into broad categories of my own experience. And so I created chapters that reflected what I was seeing about myself. Because again, I kind of finished the book up nearly 2 years after my first wife died. So I had kind of gone through a lot. And in general, the poems seem to divide themselves pretty evenly. So the chapters in the book, the first one is called Someone Died Today. And that's 14 poems about experiencing the shock and the finality of death, even if we were expecting it. I'm going to read a poem that I wrote called Sunday, which is a day when I was most definitely not expecting death to come. And it's about the day that my first wife died. Together, we survived the terrifying night of CPR and defibrillation, too many tubes and wires and doctors, my kisses on your forehead and your eyes kissing me back, until your EKG exploded and they told me to leave. I sat outside in the hallway talking softly with you. In the morning, though your eyes seemed empty, I expected your recovery and went home to sleep, only to be greeted by a ringing phone and an urgent voice. And I was out again, stuck in traffic on the Bay Bridge, praying, screaming at God to get me to you in time. Hoping that curses and prayers might be enough, I inched and fought my way through traffic and despair until finally free, nearly drowning, I plunged into the streets racing to San Francisco General. Sometimes now I like to imagine what I would have told the police if they'd noticed. I like to think that I wouldn't have pulled over. I would have just plummeted on at 70 miles an hour up Potrero Avenue, letting them catch up to me in the parking lot as I ran inside. My wife's dying, I would have screamed. But they didn't notice. I ran inside alone to find my friends crying and you dead. So the next chapter is called The Raging Storm. And The Raging Storm has 21 poems about the storm of emotions that overwhelm us after someone's died. Some of the poems are really raw, but when you're in that place of rawness, it can be a relief just to be able to tell the truth about it and read the truth about it and know that you're not alone in that place. Sometimes you might feel like you're going crazy, and it's good to know that other people have been there too. So I'm going to read one poem from that chapter. This was written by a woman whose son committed suicide. I'm sorry, died by suicide. It's an old habit. It's a horrible thing to say. It's called How So? Doing fine, he always said. He phoned each week, just like you should, on Sunday, around 8. He never forgot, like some. Teaching at the college, proud. Oh, yes, I was proud. I showed the pictures of the children, one named after me. She has his smile and mine. Clean bill of health, not broke or stoned or out of gas. Took care of his own just fine, and even sent me violets on my birthday. How so? I cringe and shiver, slumped into that spidery corner, heart dripping blackest blood beside me, mother of a suicide. The next chapter has 17 poems about the pandemic, it was not just about death because of the pandemic, but grieving deaths during the pandemic, because it affected so many people who weren't sick. You couldn't visit someone in the hospital, you couldn't have a funeral. So this is about that. It's called Pandemic Funeral, and it's by Kirsten Porter. There is no body, no casket, no roses, just a computer screen of faces to say goodbye to you. My cousin, the lanky boy of my childhood, just a year older, a foot taller, bruised at the knee, quiet but kind, always kind. How do we send you off? Without a church, without hand-holding, without leftover soups and casseroles, the rituals of our grief achingly unobserved. We tell our stories, your stories, the sounds of our voices reaching through the screens, the way we touch each other when we remember you. The next chapter is called But You Elude Me, and that's got 24 poems about the quieter, kind of seemingly endless drudgery of continuing on a life that hurts and seems to have no meaning. And that kind of phase or experience, it can go on for a long time. And as I said, I mean, you can go back and forth between these phases, as anyone who's been there knows. So I'm going to read a poem from that chapter called Mistaken Identity by Julie Hagee, whose brother died in a house fire. I thought I saw you the other day. My heart beat like mad. I followed you closely, praying that I wouldn't lose you again. I wanted to run right up, hug you, and tell you how much I missed you. I wondered where you would say you had been, if you would be glad to see me too. But then you turned and looked, only to leave me standing there, caught in the realization that this was a case of mistaken identity. Suddenly, I felt my heart's refusal to believe that you were ever gone to begin with, and the numbness, God, the numbness. So I went home, locked the door, crawled into bed with your picture under my pillow, and prayed that when I woke up, this would all be just a dream. The next chapter is called Begin to Heal. And it's not so much about seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, but it is about beginning to find our way out of the dark. And I'm going to read a poem by a woman named Nori Ross, whose brother died by suicide. And it's called So I Will Light a Candle. So I will light a candle for him, for the frightened, angry boy who lived inside, for the confused and fearsome man who raged against the world and railed against his life, for the running man whose demons finally overtook him. I will light a candle and say, be at peace. Be at peace now. Even while I know that peace is the other thing beside his life that he took from me. The next chapter in the book is called The Breath of Great Spirit. And that's 23 poems about integration, finding meaning, kind of letting go, not of our loved ones, but maybe of the pain. The argument against letting go, which I read earlier, is from this chapter. And let's see, I'd like to see, I have one of the contributors to the book named Jazz Kendrick is here, I think. And so I wanted to give her an opportunity to read her poem. There you are. Let me unmute you.
Jazz, if you would put up your hand, what I'd like to do, if you're okay with it, is, okay, great. I'm going to add you here to a spotlight with Mike, so it looks like you're
Great, thank you.
station there, and you are unmuted. Thank you.
Okay.
So yeah, Jazz, you can just talk for a moment about who you wrote your poem for, and it would be wonderful to hear you read it. Thank you.
Okay. This poem, the subtitle is With Tom, My Son. I wrote this right after I lost him to glioblastoma, which is an incurable brain kind of cancer. He was 45, and that's a little young. I was kind of, as mom, I was thinking, oh, he's going to go into midlife crisis any day now. And instead, he went somewhere totally different. So this is a poem about accepting loss, not about processing grief, but about accepting. And it's about taking a walk. And I want to comment that I never took walks before the day that I wrote this poem. And I am 2 years later walking pretty much every day. So grief is a transition in many ways. Around the block. Mornings much cooler on hot Texas summer days, but 7 p.m. was your choice to take a walk. Daily timing yourself from to the front door, re-entering with declaration of minutes, 7 your best. Neighbors were startled, knowing your diagnosis, and I confessed those were long minutes for me, sitting with fingers laced inside that front door, trusting spirit to buoy your energies, guide your feet. Now you are free walking over the Rainbow Bridge, perhaps taking giant leaps, cloud to cloud, like your youthful leaps on the backyard trampoline, before responsibilities, future still uncharted. While I anchor in the chair opposite yours, now empty, marveling that you came into my life, that you departed your body with relative ease, amid family blessed by your 46 years. And last night at 7, I rose from my chair to walk around the block, each step tracing yours, guided and buoyed by sense of you watching. I'll walk with you again tonight. I'll make one little footnote. He died the day he turned 46, so I think of him as 45.
Thank you so much, Jazz.
Thank you.
And I'm going to read one more poem from that chapter that's, for me, sort of a bookend to the one that I read called Sunday, about the day that Susan died. And this was after I had married my second wife, Yvonne. And it's called Time Passes. Bright red dragonfly hovers by my face, slips off and returns again and again. Cat watches with vague interest from his shaded lair under the patio table. Yvonne tends the flowers, picks a zucchini and strawberries for dinner. Life continues now as if you had never been here, though I am here because of you. Your death connected me forever to what lies beyond this world. I felt that light inside me always. Rudderless, beguiled, I long to join it. But time passes. Yvonne is smiling at me. We talk of dreams and having children. This garden is exploding with life, and I'm no longer in any hurry to leave. So the last chapter of the book is, I called Time Passes. And one of the things I'll mention is that all of the chapters in the book were titled after either titles of poems or lines from poems that are in the book. This particular one, the poem I just read you is from The Breath of Great Spirit. But one of the things that happened when I was putting together this new edition, 30 years after the first one, is I tried to contact as many of the original contributors as I could. And I was able to find over 30 of them. And I wanted to know, I had just read David Kessler's book, Finding Meaning, The Sixth Stage of Grief. And he was someone who had worked very closely with Elisabeth Kübler-Ross for many years. And he'd written this book, I think, in 2020. So I wanted to know how grief had changed for them over time and how they had grown, what sort of meaning they had found, not in the death of their loved one, but in the transformation that they experienced through their grief, how they'd grown and changed, and what did they wish they knew then? What did they know now that they wish they'd known then? And so 17 of those people sent me responses, and I edited their responses into short essays. And some of them also sent me more recent poems about their losses. And so I put those essays and poems into this chapter called Time Passes. I'm pretty sure that this is the only collection of writings and poems about older grief that's been processed. It's almost like you might call it a vertical study. So, when we talk about grief and healing, usually we talk about healing from grief as if it's a wound that eventually goes away. But my experience is that healing comes because of the grief. And I think Elisabeth would have said exactly the same thing, or I'm sure did say many times. If when we're dying, the healing isn't that we are cured, the healing is on the inside. The healing is in the way we change and grow and open. And I think grief causes the exact same sorts of transformations in us. And so, so I'm going to read an essay because I think it very profoundly demonstrates that for many people, grief lasts for the rest of their lives. But it also says how we can grow as a result of that grief. It was written by a woman named Mara Titel Shade, whose brother died from cancer in 1989. And she had a few poems in this book. And then so she sent me some information and a new poem, which I'll read for you as well. So she wrote, "My writing is probably what was most impacted by my brother Alan's death. As a child, I had wanted to be a writer, but could never figure out what to write about. After Alan's death, I found a writing group that emphasized the free writing approach. This process gave me a way in, and writing became my primary way of coping with his death and my grief. Over the years, I took many classes and workshops and participated in other writing groups. Not only did this allow me to return to my childhood dream, it also helped me create a social network. For many years, it seemed like Alan, her brother, and my grief were the only subjects I wrote about. But eventually I did start writing about other things. Over 30 years later, however, I'm amazed by how often my writing still returns to him, the night preceding his death and my own grief. In January 2021, I marked the 32nd anniversary of his death, and my poem, Your Ring, was written only about a month earlier. I use my writing experience to help others find their voices by leading my own workshops. I've worked in schools, libraries, and senior centers, as well as with frail and memory impaired seniors. By leading workshops that focused on writing as a tool for healing, I was also able to give back to the wellness community, now the cancer support community, that supported my family through my brother's illness and death. My experiences with grief have made me better able to support others coping with the loss of their loved ones. I have learned that grieving is a never-ending journey. The beginning can be a long, hard trek up the mountain, but the terrain eventually smooths out, leaving only occasional rolling hills. Sharing that knowledge is the most valuable thing I can give to someone who's just starting that journey. And this was the poem that she wrote about a year ago. I'm sure the metal remembers you in its cold, uncompromising way, not like my memories, which shift and alter, creating their own realities. I wear your ring, plain gold, your initials etched on the simple flat top and curlicue letters, which make them almost illegible. If I stare long enough, though, they come into focus. I really don't remember if you ever wore this ring, but it is my keepsake of you, my talisman that lets me believe you're still looking after me, protecting me like a big brother should. Maybe it doesn't have a memory of you. Its metal never bent to the shape of your finger, but my flesh connected to your metal fills the hole you left behind. So I wanted to say a little bit more about how the experience of grief remains. I've been remarried for a long time. I've got a grown son. I mean, so many things have changed since Susan died. I thought I'd finished with grief a long time ago. I read you my poem Sunday earlier about the day that Susan died, but the night before that had been very traumatic for me. She'd collapsed on the floor, her heart had stopped, and then she woke up, and I took her to the hospital. I never really dealt with the kind of trauma of that until last September, when I woke up with the emotion of that night really fresh. I had some disturbing dreams, and I woke up, and that night was just right there after 31 years. So I sat down and I wrote a poem about it, which once again helped me to feel listened to get my pain out on paper where it could breathe and dissipate. And I called it Saturday Night. And so I'll read that to you just to get a sense of that. I remember clearly, after 30 years, the sound of you collapsing on the floor in the other room. How I ran in and saw you stiffened, unconscious, your head pulled back, eyes staring, mouth slack. How I put your ear to my chest, listened for a heartbeat, and heard nothing, until you suddenly awakened and asked, "What happened?" How I drove you to San Francisco General in the night. How you stiffened again in the passenger seat. How I kept driving, looked over, saw your contorted face, slammed my right fist hard into your chest. How you woke up and said, I think I fell asleep. How I sat in the ER, waiting, worried, while they wheeled you in. How a moment later from the triage area, I heard you cry out, a single, brief, terrified wail that pierced through the din and stabbed me in the heart. And then, nothing. I can still hear that wail as though it were last week. It was the last time I heard your voice. And so the reason I shared that with you is for two reasons. One is to, again, just sort of, you know, it wasn't painful in the way that fresh grief is, and yet it was there unprocessed after all that time. And writing that poem just opened me to it, and it helped me to let go of it. And as I said, just breathe with it and let go of it. The other piece of that is when my grief was fresh, my biggest fear was that it was going to end. And I didn't want it to end because that meant that I would forget Susan if I let go of the pain. And I learned a long time ago that letting go of the pain didn't mean I had to let go of her. But what I learned from that morning last year is that even after 30 years, grief will sneak in once in a while and do its work. It demanded my attention, but in a more gentle way. So at the end of the book, I included short bios of each of the contributors that explained something about what their loss was or why they wrote their poems. It wasn't, I didn't think that readers really cared, you know, what they did for a living so much, or where they lived. It was really, you know, who wrote this poem? And so the bios are there, and then I've got the page numbers where their poems appear. So if you read a bio and you want to see what they wrote, you can find their poem easily. So the loved ones of people was kind of everybody. It included friends, parents, spouses, siblings, children of all different ages. The subjects of their poems died from cancer, COVID, accidents, suicide, old age, other diseases. So here's an example of one of the bios. This was a woman named Rosemary Palmyra. Rosemary Palmyra was very close with her father, but was not given any support after he died when she was 8 years old. She spent much of her life feeling like she was carrying a monstrous secret that no one would understand. After her first child was born 22 years later, she finally found the courage to ask for help. Rosemary has been a therapist, social worker, teacher, translator, and widely published writer. She is now a child psychologist who works primarily with refugees and asylum seekers, paying it forward. So one question that often comes up is, why did these people share their poems with you? And I think the answer's in many of the emails and letters that I received with the poems. Overall, it came down to what Rosemary said. They wanted to help others who were grieving. And doing that was meaningful for them and aided in their own healing. And as I said, I kept everything from that first edition. So I've got a couple of letters I'll read excerpts from. One is a woman named Renee Esposito, who wrote a poem called Years of Tears. And I won't read you the poem, but her father, well, you'll get what the poem's about from her letter. I'm responding to your call for poetry at the suggestion of my therapist. And because I know it would help me heal if I could honor my dad and my work in this way. My dad died from a heart attack some 40 odd years ago. And though the memory is unclear, I feel deep within me that I was present when he collapsed on the living room floor on October 28th, 1949. She sent this to me in 1992. The following poems were written within the last 1.5 years as I have struggled to come to terms with and resolve his death. Unfortunately for me, my mother was unable to provide the emotional support needed by a 4-year-old child who experiences or witnesses such a traumatic event. The poems I'm submitting to you were my gift to my dad when I visited his grave last fall for the first time in my life. My work as a hospice social worker also played a major role in my journey. As I worked to help my families come to terms with death, so too was I. And then she said, I don't know what or who will allow me to cry unabashedly, but someday. And then she just said, if I could use any of her poems, she'd be honored. And then here's another letter from a woman named Annie Brooke, whose husband died just a few months after they married. A friend told me you were interested in poems about grief. My husband, Jack Seary, died in January, and I turned to writing as one way of feeling deeply and trying to express the unfathomable sense of loss. Jack's death has been an incredible teaching for me, a gift in many ways. I have had to keep my heart wide open and let it break again and again. It's been a true journey of surrender. I hope you can use these poems and that they may help others in the same mourning and learnings. So I'll talk just a little bit about how people can make use of this book. What I found is that some social workers and therapists have used it with their clients, either reading them poems or offering it to them or working with them. But mostly, I think the people who are getting this book are people who are grieving and want that sense of companionship that I was talking about. And so I did kind of talk about that. At the very beginning of the book, I have something called a note to the reader, which I'll read you. The sections of this book follow more or less the path of grieving as I experienced it, which is to say that they only partially coincide with the stages we are so often told our grief should follow. In general, we all move from the shock and agony of the raging storm toward, hopefully, a sense of the presence of the breath of Great Spirit. But everyone grieves differently. I'm not implying that your grief journey should follow a particular map. You may find at any given time that one section will resonate for you far more than the others, or a particular poem will inspire you. You may also find that some poems say exactly what you don't want to hear, even poems which previously inspired you. What is cathartic one day may be uninteresting the next. What presently seems pointless may become profound a few months from now. Grief is a nonlinear process, so feel free to bounce around the book. Some of the poems in this book may elicit a strong emotional response. That's one of the goals of this book, to help you identify and express what you're feeling. However, if your grief is very fresh, try not to read too many poems at once. At such fragile times, we sometimes don't realize that we've taken in too much until we suddenly find ourselves overwhelmed. Take your time. You may even want to talk with a counselor or therapist to help you work with the feelings that arise as a result of your reading. The authors and artists in this book contributed their works in the hope that they might help you heal, as their creative expression helped them to heal. Perhaps this book will inspire you to express yourself creatively as well. If so, there's a section in the back to keep your own poems. And when you're unable to find the words to speak the depths of your own heart, I hope it will be a resource for you, a place to sit and know that you are not alone. So I'm going to finish with one last poem. It was written by a woman named Rose Drew many years after her infant daughter died from SIDS at a few weeks old. It's called Elephant. You're still in the room. The room's just larger. Years spent ignoring you, or else dragging out your secret life, the way a magician flourishes bouquets from milk jugs. Ta-da! Now seen, then not. Enormous invisible reason for so much. And time moves on, events engulf a life. One undersized elephant gets pushed aside. Soon enough to trot you into view, remove the camouflage seems a petty, distracting trick, or at least too sad to mention. Most people prefer a laugh than to rehearse old sorrows. But you've remained, blended effortlessly in with houses and plans, constant reminder that life is too short for injustice and squandered dreams. You've always been here, in a room that's grown to dwarf you, my elephant, my mentor, my muse. It's me who has changed. And so that is about it on the prepared part of this. My website is mikebernhardt.net. And if Susan doesn't put it in the chat, I can. But you can order the book through there. You can get it on Amazon or your local bookstore. There's links to do it all different ways. There's also, I have a page there with 15 or 16 of the contributors reading their own poems on video. And that's kind of neat to hear them the way they intended them. So I hope you'll pay a visit there. And I'd love to know if you've got any questions.
Mike, thank you so very much. We will go to questions. I'm going to give people the opportunity to unmute themselves, but I would ask that if you are going to be asking a question, if you could use the hand raising, which is going to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a little thing that says reactions, a little smiley face. And if you click that, then I can see next to your name that you have a question. And I will be sending an email out with the link to this recording and with, I see Yvonne, thank you, Yvonne has posted where to purchase the book, and we'll also put Mike's website up in the hopes that you'll be able to connect directly with them. Mike, there's a couple of things when you were talking about the Center for Attitudinal Healing. That is also where I spent a lot of my time in the late 80s and early 90s in the caregiver support group. And then with facilitating a young adults group for kids that were teenagers that had life-threatening illness. And I cannot say enough about the just the support that was available there and the incredible opportunity that was to be involved. So that was a good memory. And I also want to say about this, the DMS and the prolonged grief, that in the way that Elisabeth's work was misunderstood by many people in terms of the 5 stages and extrapolating things that Elisabeth did not say. I want to just say that for people who are experiencing prolonged grief, this is different than just feeling grief-stricken a year after your death. This is it's research-based for people that I've certainly met these folks. We're just stuck, like very stuck in the days and the moments after a death occurred, and weeks or months or years later are not, for whatever reason, able to move forward to process their grief. And the process of working in prolonged grief, the assessment and the actual treatment is very clearly defined and very works for almost everybody that has gone through that. So I know that there's a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of concern around this being a DMS diagnosis, but for people who are so stuck in their grief that they can't move forward, and 13 months after, even in hospice, a lot of hospices can't see people after the 13th month of their grief. And so this is an opportunity for therapists to work with people, be reimbursed, and for people to move on so that they can enjoy the natural grief that you would be moving through instead of this stuck, burdened, and intractable feeling of grief. And Catherine Shear was one of at the forefront of the, it had been called complicated grief. They've changed the name because it's just too confusing to people. All grief is complicated when you're navigating it. But this is called now prolonged grief for people that are really stuck. And most of those folks are self-identifying. They're coming to them saying, I am so stuck. I can't get past this incident that happened. And it's been years. And I just don't feel the grief that normal people feel when their beloved dies. So she's going to be speaking, I hope, sometime early in 2023. And I've worked with her and with therapists who are working in prolonged grief. And for the people that they have supported, it's been extraordinarily beneficial to them.
Yeah, I think the issue might be more that when they say that, then the average person might think there's something wrong with me because it's lasting more than a year, because that gets misinterpreted, just like
Yes.
Elisabeth's 5 stages. And so I think it's more just because you're grieving more than a year doesn't mean there's something wrong.
That is
absolutely. There are so many people who might need real support. So, and insurance will pay for it now. So.
Yeah, and that is not, I mean, there's a whole assessment process, and many people would not, that they're, yes, it's not. So I just want to put it out there because it said there is a lot of misunderstanding about this. And I want to make sure, especially for people who could benefit from it, that they understand what this is. It's a different than, or what would people normal, whatever that is for a grief process, but this intractable feeling of not being able to move past the incident in any way, and just being sort of fixated in a way on that. It cripples people's emotional, spiritual, psychosocial life. So that's
absolutely
why that work can be so powerful. And I just want to say the poetry, it's been, this is something that we share. We're doing volunteer trainings. Poetry is at the beginning. We read that before every chapter, anything we're training on. And I just want to thank you for reminding me about how powerful poetry is. It just can cut right to what the essence of what needs to be most deeply expressed. So I so appreciate that. There was a question. I see Martha, we're going to come back to you. Erin had posted and said, can you speak about Duende? I think is what she had posted. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Okay.
Erin is a friend of mine, but yeah. So, I mean, I think Duende is a Spanish concept that has to do with kind of it's sometimes referred to almost as like a demon that lives inside of us. And the Spanish are, there's a very dark aspect to their culture. And Duende is really, it's that sort of, I would say it's in this context, it's really the force that might drive us to express poetically or in other means. It just, the grief, I think, it's just so intense, and it demands expression. And Duende is a similar sort of a concept in that in the best flamenco is inspired by Duende, and the dancer seems like they're possessed. And so I think that there's a relationship there.
Thank you so much. Martha, I am going to bring you down here. And if you could unmute yourself, please. And you go ahead. Thank you.
I'm so delighted to be here today with you, Mike. This was just an exquisite program.
Thank you.
As I recall, you've done some sessions through the Institute for Poetic Medicine, and you have a relationship there. I'd love for you to speak to that if that's correct.
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. I actually, one of the things that I did last year, Martha was one of the co-facilitators of it, was I was certified in a program to be a facilitator of a program called Poetry as a Tool of Wellness. And it really is a program to help guide people in it doesn't have to be about grief. It can be about any aspect of life, but it's really to help people to write poetry that authentically expresses what's up for them. It's a wonderful program, and so that I participated in that through the Institute for Poetic Medicine, which I mentioned briefly before. The director of that, John Fox, is someone I've known for a very long time. Actually, Susan, I think you know him as well. He wrote the foreword for the current edition of this book.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, and he sent it to me and said, I hope you like it. And it was just wonderful. So if you buy the book, you can read his foreword. I think it's in some ways, it's one of the best parts of the book. It's just beautiful. And he actually talks about an experience he had with Elisabeth Kübler-Ross back in his early 20s. He wrote the foreword for the second edition. I wanted to mention also that Jerry Jampolsky from the Center for Attitudinal Healing wrote the preface for the first edition. He was very supportive of me and this project. It was very helpful for me to have his support there, especially at that time. So.
Thank you. I remember we had a dear friend here in Austin who opened a Center for Attitudinal Healing here on behalf of her son, who had died. After spending a good deal of time with Jerry Jampolsky, and they taught courses in love is letting go of fear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much. This was just excellent.
Thank you, Martha.
Shira, do you want to turn on your camera and then I can, there you go.
Okay.
You down.
Thank you, Sue.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah. I am a child life specialist. I did that and I worked with Elisabeth. I was one of her main staff people working with adults and kids. Created children and teenage workshops for Elisabeth, besides the LDT that Elisabeth did so beautifully. I worked in a hospital for 9 years in pediatrics, and I worked at Hospice for 7 years. So I have quite a history of working with death and dying, specifically mainly with kids, but when in hospice, I was also working with the adults. I want to give you my perception of my understanding of what I've seen and experienced, because we've talked about grief and the length of it. My experience has been that the first year of the death of a person, whether it's a child, adult, teenager, etc., is the first most difficult year. It's the first year of the birthday. It's the first year of Christmas or Hanukkah or any of the other holidays. It's the difficulty, the first year of anniversaries. So the first year is the most difficult year. And it's also the time that choices should not be made, such as moving to a new area. That, because of the emotion, that really needs to be acknowledged. And of course, all of you, I'm sure you know that emotions are like a roller coaster. You're doing fine, and then suddenly you just sort of break down. You hear a song that reminds you of something that you sang together or you heard. Going shopping together. There's out of the clear blue sky, maybe the emotion. So the first year is the most difficult. The second year is the anniversary of the first year. It's the second time now you are experiencing the birthday, anniversary, holidays, et cetera, et cetera. And you're coming out of it a little bit, but I want to be clear, you don't suddenly just stop grieving, but the intensity is the first year especially, the second year, yes, and the third year, it starts to calm down a little bit. Things are a little bit smoother, but still the idea of seeing something, you go shopping and it's like, oh, I bought that purse for my mom that looks just like the same purse, or I played a game. But grief is there, grief will be there. But the way that you know that you're working it out is that when you first grieve, it's like you just fall all the way to the bottom. But the way you know that you're working it through is that you still grieve, but you come up much faster. It's like when there's been the grief of somebody loving that you love, you may be crying for like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever, and you're just sobbing and sobbing and sobbing, and perhaps you're crying like every day. By the second year, you don't cry that much, but still the grief is there. By the third year, again, you may be still crying and still, but you don't stay down there 10 minutes. You come up like 3 minutes. I don't say that you have a watch there, but the way you're working it through. So like I've heard people say to other people, oh my gosh, it's 6 months and she's still grieving. Oh my God, he's still grieving. Yes, you are grieving the rest of your life, but the first 3 years are the most difficult. And then you go on as the best you can. And then you write, Mark, you did such beautiful work and when you're speaking today, talking about other people, sharing your experience, you're writing the book, you did a beautiful job. I really love listening to you and how lovely it was that everybody contributed with you. So just wanted to know that people want to know, is there something wrong with me? You know, here it is a year and I'm still crying. And here it is, I said, Mike, I'm sorry, I said Mark and I meant Mike, please apologize. My partner is Mike. So it's like,
Yeah.
sorry. The bottom line of it is that the pain will always be there. There's been a loss. You've lost something. But the need for crying will be less. But don't let people say to you, well, it's 6 months. Well, it's a year. What, you're still crying? You're still upset? Let it go. I always say when something like that comes up, I go, thank you for sharing, you know, and then walk away. I don't start to get into an explanation about why and how come and, you know, no. Thank you for sharing. The other thing that I will move on is that a lot of times when there's been a death of a grandchild or a child, and somebody asks, how many children do you have? And people want to know, oh my God, what do I say? You know, because one has died. So they just tell them the children that are still living, no, you've had 3 children. One is living somewhere else, but you have 3 children. And you can say that because you had another child there, you had another son, you had another daughter. I have 3 children. One is living someplace else, and you don't have to go into details. So I just wanted to share a little bit about it. And again, Mike, it was really wonderful. I really enjoyed listening to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mira.
Yeah,
We have
I'll just say real quickly, I know someone who her adult child died, and she said, I have 3 children, one in heaven and 2 here.
yes. Peta had a hand up. Peta, did you take your hand down? I'll go ahead to Ellen, who's got her hand up here. If you could turn on your camera, Ellen, then I can drop you down into Ellen Channels, who has your hand up. Are you able to turn on your
I'm
camera?
here. I'm trying to figure out how to turn my camera on.
Oh, thank you, because then I can drop you
Okay,
down.
there we go.
Thank you. I will add you here to Mike, and you can go on ahead and just ask him or say whatever you'd like to say.
My question was just, in my experience, the average person is afraid of writing poetry and afraid to try to express anything when they're feeling whatever it is, grief, happiness. And if you had any advice on how to get people going who maybe feel like they're not good enough to write poetry.
Well, that's a whole course. But I'm actually doing on September 6th, I'm doing a 1.5 hour workshop with Reimagine, if you know that organization, on writing poetry for your grief. And I'm using some of the tools that I learned in poetry as a tool of wellness. But so the thing I didn't mention is in the back of the book, I've got one last little chapter called Courage to Write. And it's I'll just read it very quickly to you, at least part of it. So I just wrote, I invite you to join the contributors to this book in expressing your own grief for yourself through poem making. The next 10 pages are blank, reserved for your voice, for your own poems or writing. If you've never written poetry, you may not know where to begin. Here's a suggestion. Pick a poem in this book that moves you and choose a line from that poem. Begin your poem with that line. What do you feel when you read that line and poem? What does it remind you of in your own loss? Are there sounds, smells, images, or memories that arise? Write those down. Your poem could be the remembrance of an everyday experience, something now lost that you once cherished or took for granted, like maybe having coffee or making your child breakfast or whatever. It might mirror the depths of your love or reveal thoughts or feelings that frighten you, even anger at your loved one or a loss of faith in God. It's all okay. Write it all down. We can't heal if we're afraid to tend to our wounds. You may think that you can't write, that your words aren't good enough, but I assure you they are precious, worth more than anything else in this book because they speak your truth. Your poem doesn't have to be pretty. Not everyone in this book used beautiful language. Write what's true for you. Nothing else matters. And so there's some writing exercises that in the workshop that I use to actually do that. But that's really the truth of it. Some of the poems in this book are extremely simple, but I used them because there was so much power and truth in those simple words. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And I love that you ended the book by encouraging people in that way. That's great.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Petra, did you want to ask any question? I saw your hand up earlier. Like that. If you do, you could unmute. You know, Mike, one of the things I was really touched by is that you were looking for this kind of book, like to hear how other people were talking about their grief and experiencing their grief. And you did not find that, so you created this yourself. And I think just as a nod to sort of some of the transformative and creative powers of grief, it was beautiful that you just asked for exactly what you needed and exactly what you wanted and created something that was so useful for so many people to have. So I just want to acknowledge that.
Okay.
And I will also include the reimagine. I am, you know, sort of for a nod to John Fox. He, for many years, some people know this, I worked with Stephen and Andrea Levine and put on workshops for them. And Stephen would tell a story about a guy that had a leg, a fake, like a fall. He had lost part of his leg, and during one of the workshops, he just took his leg off and put it aside, and just he would tell that story, and people would laugh, and it would be a great story. He told it a lot better than the way I'm saying it right now. And years later, I met John. He's like, "Well, I'm the guy in the story about the leg." So he used to come to. John's hosted or supported a couple of volunteer events that I used to do with Mission Hospice and with when I was at Sutter Hospice, and did nights with our volunteers of poetry writing. And I would encourage anybody, I'm going to see if he will speak maybe in the early part of 2023. We'll book through the rest of the year for this, but see if I can get him to do something with poetry. And
He's amazing.
yeah, he's just
So,
remarkable. Yeah. And just decades of committing to his craft of poetry and helping other people find their inner poet, which he believes we all have.
Yeah.
Anybody else have a question or just even anything that they were moved by or something that they found that has been useful in terms of their reading, their writing, or their grief process? Please feel free if you can't find the icon at the bottom for raising your hand. Perhaps, there you go, Petso. I'm going to just bring you down here. Thank you. And we met last time. This is Petso. Why don't you go ahead and you can unmute yourself.
here I am. Okay. I haven't read it yet, but I heard about a book. Are we still? I'm still having trouble. No.
We
No,
hear
you
you.
can hear you fine.
Oh yeah. Okay. Am I unmuted? It looked to be unmuted to me.
We can hear you fine. We can hear and
Good.
see you. Yeah,
Okay.
no.
Okay. So I heard recently about a book by Delia Ephron, who's the sister of Nora Ephron, who died of a terrible genetic or disease. And Delia has it as well. And Nora, if you know her at all, kept her illness very, very secret, and in fact almost died still working. And then it was revealed. Delia has done the opposite of that, and she's written a book, I believe it's called Left on 10th Street. And the word left refers to the fact that she lost a partner to death. And she writes about her life after that loss. And as I say, I haven't read it yet. I'll try to get it my local. I'm in Australia. It's like the end of the world for things like this. And I was told you'll get it at your local library. Well, of course I couldn't. And I guess I have to buy it, and that'll take 3 weeks or something to get here. But I believe it's very good. She writes about a new relationship and the right person, and the way that relationship works so well, given her awareness and given that person's ability to understand and tolerate the fact that there is still this former relationship being processed. I'm oversimplifying it because I haven't read it at all yet, but that's the sense I got of it. And the notion of lost. I myself worked with a man in psychoanalysis who was absolutely, the word was used earlier, fixated on his wife's death, which was pretty horrible. And he hadn't done any grieving at all. And I said to him, he had a relationship with the person he referred to as his ex-significant other. In other words, it was a relationship that didn't last. And she left. I got him to verbalize that what happened. She left him, and I said, yes, and Helen left you. That was his wife's name. And that was the first little chink I made in his. He said, no, she didn't. She died. I said, well, she's not here, is she? You know, and that was a very profound moment for him in his work with me, which wasn't about grief at all, according to him. Nothing like that, nothing to do with that. And he just wouldn't go there, you know. So anyway, that's my little contribution. I myself have started a website and have something going that I won't even mention, except that I'm not presenting it as grief. I'm working with people suggesting that, I'm oversimplifying it, but that there is life after loss and that they can get on with life. And I think Mike's work verifies that. And it doesn't mean you're on hold forever and you know, in the corner grieving and getting people motivated and finding how to have a life given that that's happened. And it's quite a big ask, and it's interesting take on it. I mean, my take on it is consistent with, I think, what Mike's saying, that you get on with life, but that is still there, and it's there for the duration. It doesn't go away. Absolutely. I myself had lost a partner in 1985, and in my recent years in this transition back to Australia and from movement within Australia during the pandemic to reconnect with family, I had a dream with where my partner came back to me and asked me, where was I and when was I coming? And I said to him, I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet. And I was telling one of my sons about this, and he said, I have dreams like that sort of thing too. And he said, maybe he doesn't realize he's dead. And I thought that was quite a little insight, because wherever he is, he's looking for me and I'm not there, you know. And I'm 85 this year. So I found that quite a pleasant dream, actually. And I didn't feel that I had a rush to comply, because my relationship has changed. The last poem that I think Mike read implied that the person had realized they had grown on. They were not the same person who experienced that loss. And that's what I'm the way I see the work I'm doing with the people that I'm who are about to be my audience, that I will help them do that. I must say I'm psychoanalytically trained. So I'm also, and I'm a former nurse, and I've done quite a lot with end-of-life care and worked in hospice and so on. So in Sydney and in New York City. So I'm, it's a big concept to hold, and I see it as a container for people who come in having fairly recently. I'm targeting people who've had lost a loved one since January 2020, and not necessarily to COVID, but because of COVID and because of my own isolation and distance and changes in my life, and the change being for me working one-on-one in my home office in New York City to working online, now located in Australia. So it's
thank you so much. I think I'm just looking at the time here.
yes,
And thank you for sharing that. I wanted to come back to Mike for just a question, and that you also raised this, because this really, when you brought this up, Mike, this powerful dream that you've recently had about your first wife and how you're navigating a relationship clearly for decades with Yvonne and raising your child. And still that this relationship with your first wife, Susan, it doesn't just vanish. There's some way that you're also navigating that. And just, in the poetry, I'm curious how you've, how that has supported sort of these two probably very different relationships. And I remember when my sort of soulmate guy died, that real reluctance to let go of the pain of any of it, for fear that then the relationship would just disappear, which of course also doesn't happen, at least did not happen. I just want to say, just before we leave, we've got just a couple of minutes, if there's anything you want to say about that.
Yeah, one thing I just wanted to say very briefly, I completely forgot to mention, and I won't spend any time on it, but I do have a chapter about grief dreams. I'd had a dream and I didn't realize that anybody else had them. In my case, Susan came back to me and we talked about her dying. But I received other poems from people about their dreams as well. So there's a section in there for that. But in answer to your question, a story that I have shared sometimes, I do some group facilitation. And I haven't shared this story in that forum, but when I'm talking to people who've lost a spouse and are wondering how do I move on, but how do I find someone new when they get to that point, if they get to that point? I share a story that I'll make very brief, but essentially what it comes down to is I knew that Yvonne was the right person for me when I could cry in her arms over Susan's death. And so, I think it takes a very special person who can hold your loss of someone else whom you love so much and not feel threatened by it. And that's the only answer I have, I think, is that it really just takes finding the right person, or getting to a point where maybe you're not crying so much anymore, where you really are ready for a new relationship and you don't have to cry over the old one anymore. So some people just take several years or many years because they need that time. They don't want to have that in their new relationship.
Mike, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I was just sending Yvonne a chat asking if she could send an email, or if you could send an email with the links that she's putting up here in the chat, because when we send the Eventbrite email with the recording of this talk, I want to make sure that those are all included in there. And I want to just thank you so much for the work you're doing for supporting people who are grieving. Earlier, I put up just a note about we're having an event on the 25th. I believe it's in the afternoon. It's with Tifa Snow. Anybody who is navigating dementia or caring for somebody with dementia, she is somebody definitely to see. So please keep that in mind. And also for anybody that is moved by any of these events, we keep these at no cost for people. And there's an opportunity to donate to the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation, and I just put that up. Mike, thank you so very much. I want to include the information about Reimagine so people could join you on September, I think 6th it was.
Yes.
September 6th. And we're also hosting an event that day for the foundation in the afternoon, perhaps the morning, I can't remember the time, with Jerry Grace Lyons from the Green Burial and Final Passages movement. So thank you for your time, for your book. We'll put the information up on how people can purchase that and your website in the link that we will be sending out. And I'm hoping to do that in the next couple of days. So many thanks. It's been wonderful to have you all here. I'm going to be able to stay just for a couple of minutes. I don't know, Mike, if you need to jump off here. I do want to turn off the recording though. So 1 second while we do that. And thank you all on behalf of the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation.
Thank you.